Your brother deserved the bonus. He's the successful one, my dad grinned while handing him the leftovers. I just nodded and stated, then he can handle your mortgage too. That evening, I terminated every payment and observed their faces drop when the landlord arrived. I, 32M, never thought I'd be the one to pull the rug out from under my own family. But sometimes people push you too far. It started 3 months ago when I got promoted to senior software architect at my company. The raise was substantial, enough to finally feel secure after years of scraping by. My brother had always been the golden child, the one who supposedly had it all figured out with his flashy sales job and expensive car. But what nobody knew was that I'd been quietly paying my parents' mortgage for the past 2 years. Dad called me that Friday evening, asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. Mom was making pot roast, he said, and they had some news to share. I should have known something was up by the excitement in his voice. When I arrived, my brother's BMW was already in the driveway. The house smelled like home. That mix of Mom's cooking and the old leather furniture that had been there since I was a kid. But something felt different the moment I walked through the door. My brother was sitting at the kitchen table, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Mom was bustling around, setting out the good china instead of our usual plates. Dad was practically bouncing on his heels. They made small talk during dinner, asking about work and my girlfriend. I mentioned the promotion, but it barely registered. They were clearly waiting for something bigger. After dessert, Dad cleared his throat and announced that my brother had received a massive bonus at work, $50,000. The way he said it, you'd think my brother had cured cancer. Mom started going on about how proud she was, how he'd always been destined for great things. Then came the part that made my blood boil. Dad got up and walked to the kitchen, returning with a takeout container. He placed it in front of my brother with this huge smile and told him he deserved the leftovers because he was the successful one in the family. I just sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, watching this unfold. My brother laughed and said something about how he'd earned it. Mom nodded along, adding that success should be rewarded. That's when something inside me snapped. Not violently, not dramatically, just a quiet, cold realization that I was done being invisible. I set down my fork and looked directly at Dad. I told him that if my brother was truly the successful one, then he could handle taking care of their mortgage payments too. The room went dead silent. You could hear the old refrigerator humming in the corner. Dad asked what I meant. My brother stopped mid-chew. Mom's face went pale. I explained calmly that I'd been covering their monthly mortgage for 24 months straight. Every month, without fail, $1,500 from my account to theirs. I pulled out my phone and showed them the bank transfer history. The dates, the amounts, everything. My brother's face went from confused to shocked to something I couldn't quite read. Dad started stammering, saying he didn't know, that they thought I was just helping with utilities occasionally. Mom put her hand over her mouth. I stood up and told them that since my brother was clearly the successful one in the family, he wouldn't have any problem taking over. After all, $50,000 was a lot more than I'd ever gotten as a bonus. The drive home was surreal. My hands weren't even shaking. I felt calm for the first time in months. But I wasn't done. That evening, I logged into my banking app and canceled the automatic transfer I'd set up 2 years ago. Then I called the mortgage company and had myself removed as an authorized payer on the account. The customer service representative was helpful, explaining that the primary account holders would need to resume payments immediately to avoid any late fees. I also canceled the supplemental insurance policy I'd been covering for them and the property tax escrow contributions I'd been making quarterly. My parents had no idea about most of these additional payments. 3 days later, my phone started ringing. Dad called first, his voice tight with panic. The mortgage company had contacted them about a missed payment. He asked if there had been some kind of mistake with my bank. I reminded him of our conversation at dinner and asked if my brother had stepped up to handle things yet. There was a long pause before he hung up. Mom called next, crying. She said they didn't have $1,500 just sitting around, that their fixed income barely covered their other expenses. I felt bad for about 30 seconds, then remembered the takeout container and the way they dismissed my promotion like it was nothing. I told her that family should support family, and that the successful family member should be handling this now. My brother took almost a week to call. When he finally did, his tone was different, less cocky, more desperate. He explained that his bonus was being paid out over 6 months, and he couldn't take on the full mortgage payment right away. He asked if we could work something out. I asked him if he'd offered to give our parents part of his bonus to help with the mortgage. He admitted he hadn't. I asked if he'd even offered to help figure out a solution. Another no. Then he tried a different approach. He said I was being petty and hurting our parents just to prove a point. That this wasn't about him. It was about mom and dad. I told him he was absolutely right. It was about mom and dad and the fact that they'd been taking my financial support for granted while celebrating his success. It was about being treated like I didn't matter in my own family. The conversation ended with him calling me selfish and hanging up. Update 1. 2 weeks after I canceled the payments, things escalated quickly. The mortgage company's automated system had been calling my parents daily. They'd missed their second payment, and the late fees were adding up. Dad had tried calling me several times, but I'd let them go to voicemail. Meanwhile, my brother had apparently tried applying for a personal loan to cover the mortgage temporarily, but his debt-to-income ratio was too high. Turns out that flashy lifestyle comes with flashy credit card balances. I found all this out when Mom showed up at my apartment on a Saturday morning. She looked exhausted, older somehow. She said she couldn't understand why I was doing this to them, that they'd raised me better than this. I invited her in and made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the cheap one I'd bought at a thrift store years ago because I'd been sending most of my income to them. I asked her if she remembered when I'd graduated college. She said of course she did. I asked her what gift she'd given me. She looked confused, then said they'd been tight on money that year. Then I asked about my brother's graduation. Her face changed as she remembered the weekend trip to Vegas they'd paid for, the expensive watch, the graduation party. I asked about my first job, my first apartment, my first promotion. Each time, she had to think harder to remember. When I asked about my brother's milestones, the answers came immediately, complete with details about how they'd celebrated each one. She started crying and said it wasn't intentional, that they didn't mean to make me feel less important. But intentions don't pay mortgages, and they don't erase years of being an afterthought. I told her I loved her, but that I was tired of being taken for granted. If they wanted my help, they needed to acknowledge what I'd been doing for them and treat me with the same respect they showed my brother. She left without saying anything else. That afternoon, my brother called again. This time, he was angry. He accused me of manipulating Mom, of making her cry. He said I was tearing the family apart over money. I asked him how much of his bonus he'd offered to help with. Silence. I asked if he'd even visited them since learning about their financial situation. More silence. Then I asked the question that cut deepest. I asked him if he'd ever wondered how our parents, on their fixed retirement income, had been managing their mortgage payments so easily for the past 2 years. He hung up again. Update 2. The third week brought what I'd been expecting but dreading, the foreclosure notice. Dad called me, and this time I answered. His voice was broken as he read me parts of the letter. They had 30 days to bring the account current or face foreclosure proceedings. He begged me to reconsider, said they'd do anything to make things right. I asked what they were willing to do. He offered to pay me back for all the mortgage payments I'd made. I asked him how, given that they didn't have the money for their current payment. He went quiet. Then he said something that surprised me. He admitted they'd been wrong to dismiss my success while celebrating my brother's. He said he'd talked to my brother about helping more, but that my brother kept making excuses about his finances. It was the first time I'd heard Dad criticize the golden child. I told him I needed to think about it. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my girlfriend and really talked to her about what was happening. She'd been supportive but hadn't pushed when I'd been vague about the family drama. She listened to the whole story, then asked me something that stopped me cold. She asked if getting revenge was worth losing my family entirely. I realized I didn't know the answer. She pointed out that my parents were in their 70s, that they'd made mistakes but probably didn't deserve to lose their home. But she also said that my brother needed to step up, that I shouldn't have to carry this burden alone. The next morning, I called my brother directly. I told him I would resume half the mortgage payments temporarily, emphasis on temporarily. In exchange, he needed to commit to covering the other half, and our parents needed to acknowledge publicly what I'd been doing for them. He tried to negotiate, saying half was too much for him right now. I reminded him about the bonus he'd been so proud of. I also mentioned that I'd been covering more than just the mortgage, insurance, property taxes, occasional repairs. Finally, he agreed. Update 3. The family meeting happened at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon. Everyone was there, which felt strange. We hadn't all been in the same room since that dinner 3 weeks ago. Dad had prepared what sounded like a speech. He thanked me for the financial support I'd been providing and apologized for not acknowledging it sooner. Mom added that she was sorry for making me feel unimportant, that they were proud of both their sons. My brother's apology was shorter and felt forced, but he committed to splitting the mortgage payments going forward. We worked out the logistics. I'd resume my payments immediately to stop the foreclosure process. He'd start his half the following month. After 6 months, we'd reevaluate based on everyone's financial situation. But the real change wasn't in the payment arrangement. It was in how they treated me. Dad started calling me regularly, asking about work, and actually listening to the answers. Mom invited me over for dinner without any special occasion, just because she wanted to spend time with me. My brother took longer to come around. The first few months of payments were clearly a struggle for him, and I could tell he resented having to cut back on his lifestyle. But eventually, he started joining our family dinners again, and the competitive edge in his voice when talking about work gradually faded. 6 months later, when we reconvened to discuss the arrangement, something unexpected happened. My parents had been working with a financial advisor to restructure their budget. They'd found ways to cover more of their expenses independently, meaning they needed less help from both of us. My brother had also made some changes. He'd refinanced his car to lower his payments and moved to a less expensive apartment. He was able to maintain his half of the mortgage contribution without the financial stress. But the biggest surprise was that they'd started a small emergency fund specifically for home maintenance and unexpected expenses, so they wouldn't have to rely on us for every financial crisis. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on everything that had happened. The revenge had worked, but not in the way I'd expected. I hadn't destroyed my family or proven some grand point about fairness. Instead, I'd forced everyone to confront the dynamics that had been hurting all of us. My parents learned to value both their children equally. My brother learned that success meant more than just earning money. It meant taking responsibility for the people you care about. And I learned that sometimes the people you love need a wake-up call to realize they're taking you for granted. The takeout container incident seemed small now, but it had been the final straw that revealed years of accumulated resentment. By removing my financial support, I'd forced my family to see me as essential rather than invisible. Would I do it the same way again? Probably not. The stress on my parents wasn't something I enjoyed, even though it was necessary. But I don't regret standing up for myself. For the first time in years, I felt like an equal member of my own family. The mortgage is still being split between my brother and me, but now it feels like a choice rather than an obligation. My parents express gratitude regularly, and family gatherings don't revolve around celebrating one person while ignoring the other. Most importantly, I learned that setting boundaries isn't about punishment. It's about teaching people how to treat you with respect. Sometimes the only way to get someone's attention is to stop giving them what they've been taking for granted.